Welcome to 73 Mentors. I am here today. I'm your co-host, Jason Vidaurri.
I'm your other co-host, Vincent and Vidaurri.
And today we are spending more time with Karl Marx. For those of you that caught the first episode, we did a little bit of bio and a little bit of his early years. Today we're going to be going kind of through his college years, his end of his college years, into his first career. So this covers a time period about 1836 to about 1845. And this is going to be really fun, Vince, because this is going to touch very much in terms of Karl Marx getting a lot of his ideas together. Now, it's not all going to be put together quite yet through this episode, but we're going to start seeing some of those influences and some of those pieces, at least to be there, to be shown. And why don't you get us kicked off with the story?
Sure. So this was a newspaper clipping. So if the newspaper clipping read, Paris riots, French authorities clashed with Paris protesters staging demonstrations against the government. Government authorities said 135 people were wounded in the protest. According to the government spokesman, about 1,700 people were taken into custody. These are the worst riots to hit French capital in decades. So this is a news clipping from yesterday, put out by CNN. But this same idea of the riots, this protesting the government, is exactly where this will come into play when Karl Marx, almost 200 years ago. Almost exactly. I mean, at that time, it wasn't so much the protesters against it. So, most people probably know, but the protesters today are protesters against the government, against taxes, raising taxes, especially fuel taxes, and that the population is upset because they think their taxes are too high. Well, at the time that we're talking about with Karl Marx, we're basically moving out of the shadows of the French Revolution, but they're still protesting in many different ways, mostly, as we'll find out, through intellectual protest. And so very strong words coming out against, at that time, was the monarchy and feudalism. And that's, again, nothing's changed. So we're going to be jumping into Marx when he comes into Paris, France in the 1940s. And we'll see how that influences his thoughts. But again, the reason I mention that story is that you can see 200 years later, we're virtually dealing with the same thing. You have a citizenry that's upset with the government because the government's not providing what the citizenry thinks that they should provide.
That's funny. We keep hitting this theme, Vince, in all our discussions were from Plato to Galileo, now to Marx, that, hey, this same story is still going on. Now with Marx, it may make a little more sense. It's only 200 years ago. We had that with Galileo, 400 years, and then Plato a couple thousand years. So some common themes in humanity and in our human experience seem to be coming through.
Yeah.
I'll touch base on Marx's bio here a little bit. We hit some of it last time, but I wanted to review a little bit and make sure we're kind of have a sense of what time period we're talking about. So Marx was born in 1818 in Trier, Prussia, which is basically the western side of Germany. He died in 1883 at age 65. And perhaps he's more familiar with some of the listeners out there, perhaps not, but he was really a journalist, a historian, a philosopher, economist, and from him came Marxism, which is leading to socialism and communism ideas. And we'll talk more about that down the future here. A couple other things on his life I wanted to hit, maybe recap a little bit, is a pretty influential figure in his life was his father. But we're going to find out here in his early life still, really in his about going in almost not quite getting into his career yet, his father died in 1838. And I remember after reading that, is like basically after that, he's like, it seemed like he didn't have any connection with his family anymore. For whatever reason, his siblings, his mother, it seemed like his father must have been that connection, because after I think I read a sentence there that said he was free to go on, and him and his wife, Jenny, who I think was another influential figure in his life, they were able to move freely after that, the way it was phrased. So I think maybe I should touch on Jenny as well, since I just mentioned her. That she, as I read about her and I read about Karl Marx and that I think she played a real key role, and we probably don't get a full record of that as a spouse and how that spouse plays a full role in someone's life. But Jenny was the daughter of what's his first name? Friar Westphalen, who was a neighbor or friend of Karl Marx's father, of a higher class than were the Marx. But anyway, so then him and Jenny end up getting together in their college years, and I think we'll hit a little bit later, Vince. I'll go in a little more depth about Jenny, but just saying that she was a key influence in his life, and that's kind of a little bit of the overview. Like I said, we're going to get hit in the years 1838 to about 45, and why don't you take us to the next point?
Yeah, well, so to get right there, so we ended up last time where he was still at the University of Berlin. So he was at the University of Berlin where he started in 1836. And then keep in mind at the time, Berlin was the hot spot or the central part where you had what would be considered liberal thought. So again, we have the fall of the French Revolution, which did impact at the time Prussia or present-day Germany. Germans are trying to get back to a more feudal system, a monarchy, trying to reestablish that. And at the same time, the only place that there's still liberal thought or free thought are in universities, Berlin being the primary one. One of the main teachers there who passed, right, who died right before Marx showed up, was Hegel. And so there's a Hegelian thought still within the university when he arrives. Marx goes to that university because he left Trier's university, or Bonn's university, to go to Berlin because he was partying too much, essentially. He wasn't paying attention, so his father ships him off to Berlin, where he's supposed to be studying law. He's supposed to become a lawyer like his father. He abandons the whole idea of studying law shortly after arriving and gets into philosophy and starts hanging around what would be considered very radical groups at that time. Mostly they're radical because they wanted to overthrow the monarchy. And they went by a name, and you can even look it up, it's called the Young Hegelians, which are a radical group that were opposing both political and religious establishments of Germany at the time. One of the guys that we're going to talk about that Marx was involved with is a gentleman named Ludwig Feuerbach, and Feuerbach influenced him a lot, but we'll talk more about him. But just so you can give a sense, so this was his college years. He ended up getting a PhD degree, not from Berlin because he was too radical with his ideas. His thesis at that time, he got a PhD from a neighboring university called Jena because they were, I guess, more liberal than Berlin. His thesis was something along the lines of overthrowing or the supplanting philosophy for theology is basically what he was trying to do, or that was what he was proposing in his doctorate degree.
That essentially theology should move aside for philosophy. So
okay,
that's what.
So theology should move aside for philosophy, and again, keep in mind at this time the theology they're talking about is Christianity. So they're trying to get rid of Christianity in order to have philosophers be the ruling party. And he got his PhD when he was 23. So again, really young man. That was in 1841. Really young man. And so he leaves the university. And Jason and I have been talking about this for a while, and this is one of the reasons he's a great influencer. It's like, what is it about Karl Marx that makes him influential? And we thought about it a lot, and these themes are starting to emerge or reemerge again and again, or be presented again and again. So with Plato and Galileo, Jason and I looked at it and said, they're good communicators. So Karl Marx, in a sense, he didn't necessarily create anything new with his philosophy. What he was able to do is synthesize it in such a way that it made it accessible to the masses. And that's the same thing that Galileo did, and to some degree that's the same thing that Plato did. So there's going to be a couple. Hegel we already mentioned. Feuerbach, I just mentioned too. These are both philosophers in a large degree, but they're not accessible. It is the writing is, especially Hegel's, is very verbose. You have to be very patient and to untangle what he's trying to say. Hegel is this idealist who's dealing with, all he deals with is ideas. He deals with what's called a dialectic idealism. So we mentioned it briefly last time, but this idea of two opposing thoughts clashing with each other, and essentially they destroy each other at the end, and something else emerges. Well, when he describes that, there are these very abstract ideas, and Feuerbach is very similar in that they're very abstract ideas. When you get to Marx, though, and you'll start seeing it, is that he's taking a lot of the ideas that these individuals have presented and making it accessible to the masses. And his masses are going to be your workers, and especially your factory workers. And he breaks it down, and he gets rid of a lot of the, I would say, esoteric descriptions. And if you open up the Communist Manifesto, it basically opens up with, this is a class. This is a class problem. This is an oppressor being oppressed. This is the oppressed and the oppressors. And again, everyone can resonate with that. It's not that hard. Where the philosophers of the day, the political theorists of the day, the economic theorists of the day are not that accessible. So again, the only reason I'm mentioning this is if you have a complex idea, and we mentioned this before, if you have a complex idea, if you're able to present it in a simplified, understandable manner that is accessible to the vast majority of people, you're going to have more influence than you present it as only for very few people to understand.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And you see that, and, like a couple ideas that are coming out of I guess this early part of his life that we talked a little bit last time, but it makes more sense to me now, is this dialectic. A little different than dialectic that we talked about with Plato, but you mentioned it already, Vincent, these opposing forces. And just to give the audience an example, one would be like, in capitalism, the view is, hey, you have these owners and you have the workers, and there's an opposing force there. Because the owners want to pay as cheaply as they can possibly pay. So you're going to have this tension where they're going to keep paying the workers less and less and less. And so the system will have that internal tension, and it'll go until it blows up and becomes something else. And so there's a piece of, I guess in this episode, I feel like we're going to get pieces of, okay, there's a piece of Marxism that he starts taking with him, and he starts assembling it.
Yeah.
But, oh, God.
No, I was going to say, and that's just exactly it, is when you have those as ideas, they're very abstract. And what Marx did is he said, okay, those are the ideas. I'm taking, in a sense, the framework, but let's make this, and Feuerbach helped him do this, let's make this more tangible. So that, we could talk about the ideas of capital versus labor, but let's make this more material. Let's make this actual, in the sense that you're oppressed because you have in a sense, an owner, or Marx would probably call you a slave, and the person who owns the company, the oppressor. Okay, let's put in again, that's part of his brilliance in the message, is that you can identify with that. Rather than if you start talking in these more abstract terms as you have capital and you have the laborer, it doesn't resonate as well. And that's where Hegel was. He didn't even talk about that, but he talked about these abstract ideas of historically what happened. And it's very hard to make them applicable. And I don't think Hegel meant to make them applicable.
Yeah. Well, one thing I see, and we're going to get, I guess, more into this as we go down, but a couple concepts on the humanity, the human condition, and on systems themselves. And what I see a lot of it in he's starting to, these arguments for this new system is a critique on the current system. Or I guess in our time, it's a critique on capitalism, right? Yeah, there are flaws in capitalism. And a couple of things I guess I see in that. One is that it's very easy for us to attribute the worst parts of humanity on the system we're opposed against, and the best parts of humanity on the system we're in favor of. I guess an example I see in this is that, okay, you say capitalism, one of the big flaws as well, the greedy people, they get the wealthy, greedy people oppress the lower people, and they have this power, and that's wrong. They shouldn't have that, right? And then you say, well, but then you bring on a new system, whether it's Marxism or some other system, but somehow now the people are behaving very well. It's like, well, wait a minute here. What happened to all those greedy people? I think we hit a little bit of this before, and maybe I'm going more fundamentally into my view of the human condition, where I look at a human and say, okay, there's good and bad in us. Sometimes the good is more manifest, sometimes the bad. And I guess I see that intrinsically within a human in our experience. But maybe that's where I differ from Marx in this philosophy where they're at. Because maybe they see it more like, well, no, the human is good, but the system around him is what corrupts him and makes him bad. Is that what I gathered from?
Yeah, that's what as I'm reading through this and getting ideas that, again, we're merging out of the Enlightenment. And let's just go a little bit further back to Galileo, is that Galileo, Newton, you've built up this repository of progress in humanity, of science. And you see how much man can progress. And in a sense, almost to a large degree, start controlling his environment, controlling how much food is being produced. And we're getting into areas where literature is being exchanged. You see all this progress. And now we're at the heart of the humanists. So Marx being a humanist in a sense, Feuerbach being a humanist in a sense. Feuerbach probably being the most literal humanist, is that as a humanist, we've taken God out of the picture. We've taken the whole idea of supernatural out of the picture. And the only things left are the flaws within the systems that humans are in. So Jason, you mentioned you see good and bad. I think the humanist would say, a true humanist would say, the only reason there's flaws are because of the systems under which we're currently at. So the flaws we see in today's world are the flaws because of capitalism, or because of corrupt governments, or corrupt whatever it happens to be. That's tainting, or that's creating the flaws of the human being. And as those people, it's mentioned in Berlin's book about Karl Marx too, and I'll read the quote a little bit later, is that as these individuals, and you say, oh, well, as soon as those people take over, then it'll be corrupt again. The point is the system itself corrupted them in the first place. So how do you expect them to rise above anything besides what they've already been oppressed? So let's just make it easy. If you have a company, and you own the company, and you have 10 workers, 20 workers, or whatever, and you've constantly underpaid them, you've mistreated them, but then one of the workers or all the workers gather together and they kick you out of the company. And now they're the head of the company. Well, what do they know about running a company besides what you've shown them to run a company, how to run a company? So what do? They hire 10 of the workers and they oppress them because that's all they know. So the point is that the humanists say that's the problem, is that you can't rise above anything. You can't rise, or let's put it more in a more moral terms, is you can't be more virtuous than the people who are above you.
Yeah.
So I think that's what at least part of the answer would be.
Yeah. So that's gonna be that's one of the challenges, I think. And the other one I see also happening in this is in creating this system that they're starting to look at. It's like, well, we want equality in the system. For instance, a simplified view might be, okay, in a single, take a single company within this Marxist frame and saying, okay, we want equality here. I got 100 workers. They all own 1% of the company. They make the decisions together, make the product together. There's an equality. There's a flattening out of a hierarchy compared to what we see in a company today. Well, I think quickly you'll see that the individuals within that company, they're not the same. We have different talents and different abilities. And so what do you do with that once you have that kind of system? Say Joe over there is really good at making their product. Okay. So now he's excelling. Well, does he get more wages now? Does he get more percentage of the company? No, he makes the same as Bob over there, who sits around and doesn't do anything all day. So I think there's always a challenge with, and it's funny too, because we really flout, or we talk about all the beauty of diversity in our society. Well, diversity means difference. So on the one hand, we're celebrating the difference in people, and on the other hand, we say, well, they're equal though. There's a tension. There's some unresolved understanding how we get that to work together. So I just brought that up in terms of systems and some of the inherent flaws that I see, that, and maybe more discussion as we move forward about these things and how they mesh together better.
Yeah. And again, I guess if making a case for Marxism is that, Jason, the only reason you see these diversities in people is because of the oppressed systems that we currently have. Why is Joe and Bob different? Is because Joe's had the benefit of having a particular ethnicity and particular education, where Bob has not. So if you were to create a better system of education, if we had the social structure, the social community that would be more collectivist, then Joe and Bob would be identical or nearly identical when they came to work for you. And therefore, Bob would put out 2 shoes, and Jim would put out 2 shoes, and Tim and Harry and Sarah and everyone else would put out 2 shoes every day. I mean, it would be identical. I mean, kind of this assembly type situation. But it's just, but it's the inequalities, it's the injustice, I would say. Marx, I think, would point, it's the inequalities, injustices within the culture, within the society, that are creating those differences that you're seeing when they come and work for you. That's,
yeah. See, I push back on that, because I mean, maybe like take physical differences, physical talents, sports talents. Take LeBron James or Michael Jordan, whatever era you want to praise. I don't care what I did. I could have the best training, the best coaching, the best nutrition in the world. Physically, genetically, I'm not going to be able to ever get to that point. I know that. I mean, there's millions of people just like me. That it doesn't matter. So I think there's something to say that, yeah, I think we could do a lot of better things to have more equality, but to say it's all going to be equal, that I'm going to be the same as this person, the same as that, in all talents and abilities, I don't think that's reality.
Yeah, I think from making a case for Marxism is that should LeBron James be earning as much money? Is he that much different than another guy in the NBA? Is that, I think he would make the case that maybe they should make similar amounts of money. He's not that much different, and that he shouldn't be making 10 times the amount that he's the guy he's passing the ball to. It should be more equal. The capitalistic system is unfair. It creates inequalities and disparities that it shouldn't, and that LeBron James would play, and everyone would play if everyone made $100,000 a year anyway. So, I mean, it was like that in the '60s, and we still had basketball.
You're going to laugh, because I did put a list together about, like, I think I'm at 30, 35 points, making the case for Marxism, because I want to make sure I'm basically taking the Plato approach, right? Because naturally I'm not in favor of those ideas. Okay, so but let me put the case together and make sure I'm getting a fair shake. So you're making me twist back and forth between the two. But
go ahead. No, I was going to say you have to. I think you have to make the best case forward.
Yeah.
Because it forces you to think about, okay, part of it, okay, he gives you a good message, but what else is the appeal? I mean, there has to be an appeal there besides that. And I think there is an appeal in that, if I'm playing go back to the NBA, if I'm playing in the NBA, I'm playing with LeBron James, okay, maybe I don't mind so much that he makes whatever, let's say $20 million a year, but I'd like to make close to that too, But if he made $10 million in it, and instead of me getting paid $1 million, I got paid $5 million, we're closer. And so, I mean, there's an appeal to that.
Yeah.
I mean, is he that much better? I mean, I'm scoring 10 points a game. He's scoring 20.
It's, you get into these areas. Well, what? I mean, you can ask the bigger question just in society, because we have it. If you want to look at financially, you have the top earners earning way more than the average worker, and you say, well, that's inequality. How much is too much? I don't know.
Yeah.
Where does it get too excessive? If I'm making 50,000 and you're making 60,000, hey, that's too much. Or is it I'm making 50,000 and you're making 200,000? Where is it too much? And it's good things to think about. I guess the other thing I see on the argument too, I'm kind of going against the argument, since you've kind of flipped me on this side, is that a lot of the points in favor of Marxism seem to be critiques on capitalism itself. It's like, okay, that's a critique on capitalism, but it's not fully illustrating how Marxism makes that better. Other than theoretically, it'll make it better. But it's like, well, but the details, help me understand the details. Well, I'm not talking about details. I'm just saying, hey, I'm telling you, hey, that's really bad that you have so many rich people and so many poor people. That's bad. Okay. So there's some of that going on too.
Well, I guess the other case that I'm thinking about when you're saying that is that we've talked about a little bit about this, is the bias, contrast bias.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you and I are together and you're making 60,000 and I'm making 50,000, there's not that much there's some contrast, but it's not huge. But if you're making 6 million and I'm making 50,000, that's a big contrast. I mean, then there's this inbuilt, let's say, resentment that starts building up. And so, and then maybe this points to part of, we'll say, socialism, because it's not entirely Marxism or communism, is if you look at the Scandinavian countries, they're primarily socialist. You can only make so much money. I mean, most workers only make so much money because once they get above that, then they get heavily, heavily taxed. Not that they're heavily taxed already. So what happens is you and I are neighbors, and everyone else in our neighborhood are all making, let's just say, $40,000. Well, there's not that much resentment between each other because there's not that much contrast between us. And that's what Marxism does. That's what I guess socialism does. It narrows the band of, you don't have these huge outliers all the time anymore. Where in America, maybe part of our resentment and part of our conflict that we have is you have people who have extreme wealth and the disparity is large, where people who have adopted socialism, disparity is less. And so they're happier.
All right. I don't know if we're going to keep going down this, or because I feel like I almost feel like maybe we should have the episode where we basically say we do a for and against, and we go back and forth on it.
No, that'd be good. I think we should do that. Turn me into a Marxist yet.
You get labeled a Marxist.
All right. Wouldn't be the first time.
Yeah.
All right. So you're going to talk about the idea of, let's just even say that whatever system, let's say Marxism, comes into full fruition. And what he's promising is everything's equal. And you won't be enslaved to a particular owner, and you'll be able to produce but not produce too much, and do you see problems in that? I mean, that the hardships will go away. I mean, that's kind of a sense what he's advocating for.
Yeah, I was thinking about this, in this reading this time. I'm thinking about my own life, and as a 44-year-old now, I've lived a little bit of life, seen some things, had some ups and downs, but where I sit down, a lot of it is I look at the things I value the most, and the places I've grown the most. So much of that has come from hardships, from the downtimes, from the challenges, from the mistakes. So in some ways, I'm like, if we ever actually did create some utopian society where you take away all that, I don't know if we're made for it as humans. And on one side, I'm like, and on the other side, I think we'd probably create those challenges for ourselves, because I don't know if it's a product of life itself, but there seems to be a need for challenge and a tension or something to overcome. You can even look at the animal kingdom, and you see those examples all over the place. I think I mentioned before, like the butterfly coming out of the cocoon. Man, it's a fight to come out of the cocoon. It takes hours and hours to struggle out of the little hole. And if you see that struggle, you're like, oh, that's too much. That's undue suffering for you, little butterfly. Let me cut that cocoon open for you to make this easier for you. Well, if you do that, the wings are deformed because they need to go through that cocoon to get formed the right way. And so if you do that, the butterfly never flies again, or never gets to fly. And that's just, I don't know what's the right amount, because I can see undue or unnecessary suffering. You want to eliminate that if you can, but to take away all hardships, all suffering, I guess I'm wary of that idea. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, give the butterfly analogy. I mean, even with human beings.
Yeah.
I mean, a baby born cesarean versus a baby born vaginally, they deal with different problems. They deal with a couple things. One is their lungs. When they're cesarean, you have to clean them out, because during a vaginal birth, their lungs are cleaned out on their own due to coming through the vaginal come through the vaginal tissue. The other thing is as you do that, a cesarean, they're exposed to different bacteria than they do vaginally. And so those bacteria are the initial bacteria that populate the GI tract. So even that, you get two different things, is that the baby who comes through vaginally, their immune system is a little bit different, their GI system is a little bit different. So I think there has to be some struggle a little bit. Yeah, I'm all for it, undue suffering. But to eliminate it altogether, and we'll go back to, you think about this, is that the idea of stories. If you hear a story that has no tension in it, no hardship in it, it's not much of a story. It's like, not much of a story.
That's just something that happened. That's no story.
Yeah. So, but if you have, the more you can build up that arc of tension and overcoming, and then continue to overcome more and more obstacles, I think you're right, is that we gravitate to something like that. We aspire to something along those lines. And you're right. I think if we eliminated nearly all hardships, we would find ways to make things hard. I mean, we just would.
Yeah. No, that's something to think about, because I remember even in career-wise, early in my career, like, it'd be nice to get a kickback job, take it easy. Well, I've had moments of those times in different places and positions. I won't mention names, but there was times when it was like that. But actually, those times are very difficult when there wasn't that challenge. There wasn't those things all these deadlines and stuff ahead. I just felt myself wanting to. Hey, I need something more. I need some challenge. I need to advance in some ways. I need to stretch my talents and abilities, put me to the test, and those times seem to be more rewarding. Yeah. So I guess we're moving into here, getting to some of the influences, and we talked a little bit of Marx, and then Vince and I were throwing back some different ideas that are related to Marx and some of the things we're starting to read into, and now we're going to get to some of the influences to Marx's thought and his ideas. We hit some of that, him being there in Berlin and in the university. After that, he moves out to Cologne, Germany, spends a few years there, and then after that goes to Paris. And Vince shared that story at the beginning to talk about Paris. This is really probably, in my mind, Vince, is probably the most formative time to his ideas. These couple years in Paris is from the years about 1841 to 1843, and really gets to work over his ideas with a bunch of other thinkers at the time, philosophers. Paris was undergoing quite a bit of revolution, ideas and thoughts going on. He also meets Friedrich Engels, who plays a big part of it in his life down the road. And just thought that was just a really revolutionary time, and time for him to get a lot of his ideas. And we're going to hit some of those here as we talk about some of these different people.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think a couple things are important to know is that as we're moving through, so he gets out of college. His father dies right before he gets out, a couple years before he gets out of college. So he has no attachment to Germany. He goes to Cologne. And the only reason Marx wanted to be an academic. He thought he was going to be able to teach. That's why he got his PhD. He thought he was going to be a teacher at one of the major universities. And he was just too radical for anyone at that time to hire him as an academic. So he gets married to Jenny, and now he doesn't have his father was providing some financial means to him. Now he has no financial means. He doesn't have an academic position, and he goes out to Cologne. And then from Cologne, he's going to move to Paris. We're going to talk more about Cologne here in a while, but he goes out to Paris. But keep in mind, every time he's moving, he has to move. He has to move from Berlin to Cologne because he's too radical. He's going to have to move from Cologne to Paris because he's too radical. Eventually, he's going to have to move from Paris to Brussels, then to London because he's too radical. Every one of these is he's putting out publications. He becomes a journalist in Cologne, and he's putting out these publications where his thoughts are just too revolutionary for even the time. And Paris is probably, as Jason mentioned, is a perfect spot for him because you have a collection of people who are, I'll call them outcasts or revolutionaries, radicals from all over Europe, and even Russia coming into Paris because they've been kicked out in a sense from their country. But Paris is kind of that melting pot, if you will, of all these intellectuals. There's some intellectuals here. I just put a small list together. So Heine, Christian Johann Heinrich Heine, which is a prominent Jewish German poet and journalist, was there. Alex Charles Henry Viscount de Tocqueville. So Tocqueville, he wrote Democracy in America, a well-known a book about America. He visited America. He was French. He was in Paris at the time. Wilhelm Richard Wagner, so the German composer, he was in Paris at the time. Ivan Turgenev, he was a Russian novelist. He wrote, if you read Fathers and Sons, I read this, Fathers and Sons, great. He's a Russian literature, one of the top writers in the Russian history. He was there. If you heard of Victor Hugo, if you ever heard of Hunchback of Notre Dame or Les Miserables, he wrote that. He was in Paris at the time. He was French. Franz Liszt, which is a famous composer and virtuoso pianist, he was in Paris at the time. So you think, and this is a small sampling of the people that were there at the time. And then you throw Karl Marx into this mix and dozens of other individuals, and you can see that this must have been just a rich environment of, and Jason and I were talking about, what did these people do? They got around and they talked, and they argued, and they tried to work out where they were, where humanity was. I mean, they're trying to understand how best humanity would move forward. This was a time of promise. In the couple articles that I read about Paris at this time, this was probably there was a decade there between 1940 and 1950 where you had some of the greatest intellectual minds come together there that have ever possibly even been in Paris at the time. So, and then again, you throw Karl Marx into that mix, and he's going from salon to salon, talking with all these people, trying to refine his ideas. And if nothing, Karl Marx's intellectual capacity was tremendous. And I mean, we talk about. I mean, Jason, we're just amazed. One of the things he was doing, and jump in here, Jason, he was trying to figure out, one of the reasons he wanted to go to Paris, outside of getting kicked out of Germany, was that he wanted to figure out what happened to the revolution. What happened to the French Revolution? And from accounts, it looks like he spent a year of nothing but reading and getting all accounts that he could have that were available, and reading and finding out why did the revolution not succeed. And therefore developed some of his thoughts in that. And he also read some of the economists too. He read Adam Smith, Ricardo. So it wasn't as if he was trying to silo himself. He was trying to get the best ideas that were available at the time.
Yeah, I got a couple, I guess, little quotes talking about, give you a sense of what the atmosphere was like in Paris at this time. One of these, and this comes from Berlin's book that we're reading, says their members formed international communities, wrote pamphlets, addressed assemblies, entered conspiracies, but above all, talked and argued ceaselessly in private houses, in the streets, in cafes, at public banquets. The mood was exalted and optimistic. One sense, as I'm reading through, it'd have been cool to really be there and hear some of these things going on and these ideas, and And another one says this. It says, at a time when printed words had a greater power to move, stirred the intellectual and passions, and served still further to intensify the already electric atmosphere. And when I read that one, I was like, oh, that's like you feel that charged atmosphere of the time. And it actually made me think a little bit of social media in our time. It's like, there's kind of an idea where the society's already at the edge, and now you have this extra something, and everything feels even more charged. I go, it's a written word. The written word. I go, the written word is still powerful. It's different now, right? There's a different format now, but it was powerful there in their society at that time.
Yeah, and that's interesting you say that. I never thought about it that way. Is it, we got YouTube, we have the internet, and I think YouTube's probably more than, or even Facebook, or let's say all the social medias. Because in a sense, it's a virtual thing, a virtual reality of what was happening at that time. You got all these different ideas immersing. And I mean, people that we would never have access to 20 years ago, we have instant access to now. Same thing here is that, Marx didn't have access to Victor Hugo. He didn't have access to Turgenev. He didn't have access to Litz. But then they come all together at this part, and then you're getting this mixture of all these thoughts. And again, I think we get the same thing to some degree on the internet, is that the idea is that they're planting multiple seeds. And you can see as we're going to go through, as Marx picks out some of these ideas and starts seeing if he could play with them a little bit and come out with something different and better. But yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right that this is a time probably as exciting as that. And not only do we, you think it's international too. In a large sense, the internet is international. Because we can go across countries in a fraction of the time. We can exchange, whether it's verbal or we can exchange written words at such a fast speed and get feedback. I think the advantage we have now that we can get feedback not just from the handful of people that can fit in the room. We can get feedback from thousands of people around the globe all at the same time to feed in that.
Yeah, that's probably also a challenge of it, right, Vince? Because now there's so many voices out there that one of your main things you're trying to do is capture attention. I got to capture attention to even get a piece of feedback. So how do I capture attention? And I think all the media is struggling with that. Well, what tends to work very well, we call it clickbait or the extreme things. Those things seem to grab the attention more. So in my mind, it tends to push us more towards the edges of ideas, so that I can even get feedback and get attention and build my following.
Yeah, interesting that you say that. Yeah, it's true. Yeah. And I guess, if we're going to contrast it to them that time and this time, is that in a sense, their ideas self-selected them. Because in a sense, they were all radical. They're all going against the current system.
Yeah,
and so you have that aspect of it, and I think you have the other aspect of these are high intellectuals. These are not your everyday individuals that are putting out content, if you will. Where today, anyone can necessarily put out content. It doesn't even have to be quality. Where there is like you have nearly the best of the best. You have the best writers. You have the best poets, and they're sharp. It's iron sharpening iron. They wouldn't have been kicked out of the country, or they wouldn't have sought refuge in Paris if they didn't have original ideas, I guess. If they weren't that controversial, if Marx wasn't that controversial, he would have stayed in Berlin. He would have been academic. Yeah. It's just all these guys are pushing the edge, and then they all come together. I think we get some of that. You're right. But I think you have to filter through a lot of nonsense to find those individuals. And again, maybe the technology is young enough that over time
we'll get there.
Competency will overcome sensationalization, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Another thing I get from this time is getting a sense of Marx and his character. I know we haven't talked much about that, or maybe a little bit, but in these discussions, I see him from the writings that, man, he was tough. I felt like if you came in and wanted to argue with him or discuss about something and you didn't have your stuff lined up, or you had a weak argument or holes in your argument, he would just thrash it and thrash you and say like, almost dismissive. It seemed like his personality was like, no, I'm not gonna. You come full bore with me, or don't give me this. I'm not gonna sit there and say, well, Vince, you had a couple good arguments there. This part of your argument's kind of weak. Let's hash it out some more. It was like, no, you're just gone. Get out of here. I don't know if you got that sense or not.
No, I did. I mean, he had no patience. He would revile. I mean, even the people I think that he tried to come close to and they try to cooperate. After a while, he just revile them just because either they couldn't keep up with him or their arguments weren't tangible enough for him. I guess part of my admiration for Marx is his alacrity with difficult subjects. I mean, it just was. And I think he expected that from other people. He expected this alacrity from other people, and when they didn't have it, he quickly dismissed them and reviled them and went on and said, okay, there's nothing to do here. I mean, there's nothing to gain from this exchange. I don't think he would have been necessarily a great person to have around to talk about too much. Yeah, that's what I'll say about that.
But it also showed his intellect and his power. Like you mentioned that the subject he started researching and the amount of content he seemed to consume during this time, and not just consume it like superficially, right? But actually really understand these subjects. I got a sense of the power of his intellect at this time. He's only like we didn't mention. He's only in his mid-20s. 20s.
That's true. I think we forget that he's a young 20-year-old. I think we'll have to double check this, but I'm pretty sure he puts out the Communist Manifesto when he's 30.
Yeah.
And so, and Das Kapital, I don't think comes, in his 40s, but still, he's a young man when he's in these circles talking about relatively difficult topics. So, again, an intellect of the highest quality is for sure. Mm-hmm. Well, and I think the other thing that's interesting about this time period, Jason, is that we have to keep in mind. I think we almost present it, or we almost see it as the monarchists against the revolutionaries or the radicals. And there's a third group in that, and that's the industrialists. So during the 19th century, you have the rise of the industrialists, the rise of the individual who has capital. And this is aside from the monarchists. This isn't, and so it's fascinating that you have basically a three-pronged group. And in a sense, the industrialists, and this is how when he started working in Cologne, the industrialists were were funding Marx's writing. So, which is ironic, is that, but their end was the same. Their end was to overthrow the monarchists. So whether you try to overthrow monarchists through businesses or companies, or businesses at the time, or you try to overthrow it through revolution, their end was the same, is to get rid of the monarchist. But there's a gentleman who talks about the emergence of the industrialist, and again, a contemporary of that time. He's a Swiss gentleman. His name's Jean Charles Leonard de Sismondi. And de Sismondi is the individual who termed the word proletariat, that when you start reading Karl Marx extensively, he uses proletariat and the bourgeois. So the proletariat are the working class, the bourgeois are basically the capitalists or the industrialists. So, and I'll read this quote by Sismondi, and this is him talking about capitalists or industrialists. He says, let me see, with an immense mass of historical evidence at a period when it requires something akin to genius to have perceived it, this is about what he's going to say, the view that whereas all previous class struggles occurred as a result of scarcity of goods in the world, the discovery of new mechanical means of production would flood the world with excessive plenty and would shortly, unless checked, lead to a class war before which previous conflicts would pale in significance. The necessity of marketing the ever-growing produce would lead to a continual competition between the rival capitalists, who would be forced systematically to lower wages and increase working hours of the employees in order to secure even temporary advantage over a slower rival, which in turn would lead to a series of acute economic crises ending in social and political chaos due to the intertwining wars between groups of capitalists. So his point was that it's no longer a movement of scarcity. Prior to the 19th century, it was a war of necessity. You have more land than I do, you have more resources than I do, and what Sismondi was saying is that that's not what's going to happen. Because of the rise of the industrialists, what we're going to have is we're going to have a class warfare, and it's going to be class against class, being capitalist against capitalist. If I can produce more than Jason, I'm going to win that war. He's going to fall out. I'm going to have more workers for me. I'm going to be able to employ more workers, and then I'm competing against the next capitalist, and it would lead to this chaos. And you can see that Sismondi had some influence with Marx, and that he starts mentioning class and this idea of capitalists being, if you want, easiest term is just bad for people, because then you create workers.
Yeah, you remind me of a quote from Karl Marx. We probably should give a little more on his context. And like we said, he's starting to grab ideas and different ideas from these different influences in his life. But this one was revealing to me, and this is at the same time period he said this, and this is part of it. It says, but revolutionary energy and self-confidence are not sufficient by themselves to enable a class to be the liberator of society. It must identify another class with the principle of oppression. So basically saying that, we could have all these great ideas and enthusiasm, but we need to identify the oppressor class. And so it's getting into these class ideas, Vince, and then also like, okay, now I got to identify the group I'm fighting against or need to be fighting against. And so he's grabbing this idea in this piece at this time.
Yep. Yeah. And so, there's, again, he's starting to pick up these pieces as he's coming along in Paris. Prior to Paris, I think what we'll find and what I'll go through now is the individuals who probably influenced him when he was at University of Berlin, as I mentioned, Hegel. We already mentioned a little bit of Hegel. Hegel, he used the dialectic, or that was probably his most identifiable contribution to philosophy. But when the dialectics is the idea that all things are in a continual process of change, resulting from the conflicts between their contradictory aspects. So again, Jason mentioned that you have two separate things coming together in conflict, and out emerges another. You can have capitalism and communism, and out emerges another, or labor and capital, or workers and the owners. They're in conflict with each other, and out emerges something different from that conflict. And that's from Hegel's dialectic. Hegel was dealing with ideas, though. He wasn't dealing with, again, material stuff. Feuerbach basically used Hegel's idea of the dialectic, and he produced what would be materialism. So he dealt with material conditions. We'll go, I think, still talk about Hegel a little bit. And one of his quotes was, "The real is the rational, and the rational is the real." So keep in mind, we are this kind of emerging out of the Enlightenment period and this idea of the rational mind. And Hegel, and this is what was going on with Berlin, and the Germans were wrestling with this idea. The young Hegelians were wrestling with ideas: what's real and what's rational. And the conservative component, if you will, of the young Hegelians were saying that whatever is real, whatever exists, exists because something rational happened throughout humanity to create that. So it's in a better form than it used to be. So economics, politics before the current German system were inferior, and as they go, they become more superior. So this idea of progression. And so whatever we have today is superior to what we had before, and whatever you can see is rational and therefore good in a sense.
Hmm.
The more radical component that Marx was in is that saying whatever is real is not itself complete. And so he was focusing on the rational. The real is the rational, meaning that these ideas, what exists today, has a lot of flaws in it because it's not whole. When you think about it rationally, and as you become more enlightened, as you become more self-aware, you realize that there's corruption within these institutions. In order for those institutions to be better, they have to mirror or they have to become what you have in your rational mind. And that's what and this is where Hegel influenced Marx, because he's thinking, and Marxism is moving towards that. Is capitalism bad? Yes. It's only bad because it's not complete. It's not whole. It's not completely rational. Is socialism better? Is Marxism or communism even better in our terms? Yes, it's moving to something more whole. It's moving to something more complete. As you become more self-aware of this, you can see that Marxism in its entirety, communism in its entirety, is a rational entity. So that's where this idea of progressing to a better place, and it came from Hegel, that Marx got. Hegel did not apply this to moving from this point forward in history. He was always looking historically back, and I think Jason mentioned this, that looking back at history and saying the Greco-Roman times, the Renaissance times had certain virtues that we can look at and we can gain something from. But Hegel didn't take it into moving forward, and that's where the young Hegelians, and in our case Marx, took it to. So again, he was more with the dialectic idealism and moving things forward. Mm-hmm. But one of his other big influences was Ludwig Feuerbach. Now, Ludwig Feuerbach was a contemporary of Marx. His best work was called The Essence of Christianity, where he basically, of the humanists, he's probably the most humanist. I mean, he's just pure humanist. I mean, his starting point and his ending point is man. There's no God. And he basically came to, in his Essence of Christianity, he's saying that the only reason man creates religion, you'll even hear this argument today, man has created religion, or created God. God hasn't created man. Man has created God. And God is simply a manifestation of all the good things that humanity sees about itself. And therefore, he creates a God in order to worship that God. But in reality, God doesn't exist. And that's where Feuerbach was. And that he was basically saying, that man, in a pure humanistic idea, is that, man, at one point, man was trying to become God. And Feuerbach was saying that man is God. Man is God because man created God with all his characteristics, and he got so close to God, and we are only labeling the ideas of God and creating that God. So, and you could see. No, go back. And how is this affecting Marx? How does this affect Marx? And you're going to see Marx takes a very antagonistic point of view on religion, and especially Christianity, or just religion in general, is that in communism, you eliminate religion. And at some point, when he was writing an essay or treatise criticizing Hegel, or at least evaluating Hegel's book called The Philosophy of Right, and this is a common, if you look it up, Marx has religion is the opium of the people. Well, this is where you get that from, is that probably Feuerbach helped him get that idea. Again, but I mean, Jason and I have mentioned it, and Marx is Jewish, but he never had really religious ties of any kind, whether to Judaism or otherwise. So it's not uncommon why he would take this view. Those are the two. Did you have something to say about either one of those, Jason?
No, the only thing, there was that curiosity from Feuerbach that talks about the perfection, or the that man as a whole can understand it all. Is almost like is perfection, kind of like you're saying. Well, the man is the God idea, and I guess I reflecting upon that thought, I'm like, I don't know where you get that from the more science side, the evolutionary side, the biology side, to think that man as a whole is anything that unique or that special beyond, other animal life. Let's say, yeah, we're a little bit more intelligent. We seem to have taken a step where our intelligence is such that we can manipulate our environment, do tools, understand things beyond the animal level. But I guess I look at that, I'm like, I don't see anything that tells me that we're going to understand it all, or that we necessarily have to understand it all because of evolution gave that to us somehow. Maybe I'll phrase it this way, Vince. I can see it's easier for us to look at maybe a lesser intelligent, say your dog, or maybe even a chimpanzee, our closest cousin. Less intelligent than us, yeah, they can learn a lot of things. Can I teach them calculus? No. Even if I spent a lot of time and did a lot of effort, can I get my dog there to understand? And no, it's beyond that capability. Well, how about on the other side of us? Look, for a chimpanzee, for instance, I think that we're only a couple % difference in DNA. Very small portion of our DNA is different than a chimpanzee. Well, how about go the other way? Something else, just imaginary, right? Something else, a couple parts different DNA than us, but that much more intelligent than us. Where they look at our level of intelligence, say, well, yeah, they can understand a little bit of physics, a little mathematics, but we're dealing with subjects X and subjects Y and subjects Z. That no matter how much time I spend with a human, I can't get him to understand that.
Yeah,
I don't know.
think.
It's just.
Yeah, I think Feuerbach, what he was aiming for was the human collective has a perfection about it. Or let's just take a common attribute that's a tribute to God. God is all-knowing. Okay, but if you put the human collective together, are we not all-knowing also? Or are we not getting really close to all-knowing? So Feuerbach would say, if we put everyone together, we would know. Humanity in itself would know. And we attribute that all-knowing aspect, the characteristic of God, to a God that we've named a God, because we realize that's beneficial. That's good, if you will. That's good. That's a good part of humanity, is all-knowing. All-loving is a good part of humanity. We attribute that to a God. Being everywhere, omniscient, omnipresent. So we attribute, it would be good if man is always present with everyone else. Okay, we attribute that. Love. So what his point was that collectively man is all those things that we attribute to God. Collectively we are. Okay. No, and I guess you see, I think that his important contribution is twofold. One is he bridges the philosophy of Hegel and Marx. So you don't hear about Ludwig Feuerbach that much. He's basically on the side of two skyscrapers, and he's a small little house. But he allowed that bridge to happen, and he kind of allowed one to transition from a Hegelian mindset or philosophy to a Marxist mindset. So he does provide that bridge. And this kind of historical background, Lenin, the revolutionary Lenin, actually read Feuerbach when he was he was sent to Siberia. So when he was in Siberia, he read The Essence of Christianity by Feuerbach. At the same time, he then took on Marxism. So again, I think it allowed an easy transition into Marxism, and so facilitated that. But those are the two big ideas that influenced him. I think that's enough for those two guys, and we'll get into more. Yeah, I think that's enough for those two guys.
Yeah. Well, I think when you bring up these idea of influences, and this really, I guess, touched me in studying Marx on this section is, I would say 3 people, maybe 4 people if you count his father, that seem to be key for Marx being Marx. And I can't help but wonder if one of these people weren't in his life, would we still know about Marx to the degree we know about him now? One was his father. We mentioned that. The other one is his wife, Jenny. And I just want to say a little bit more about her at this point, talking about influences in his life. I should mention the other one, since I said threw a number out there for you. The other one was Jenny's father, his father-in-law, Freyer Ludwig Westphalen, and that was more influential in his early life, and for him to me to kind of that spark for him to move forward with his life and have some confidence in himself. And then we're also going to be talking here shortly about Friedrich Engels, which was a huge influence in his whole work, really. But Jenny, I wanted to say a few things about her, and from the reading here, there's a couple parts that really, I guess, put her in a light, and how well, I'll just say she was so dedicated to Karl and his work that he did. He leaned on her unhesitantly at all times of crisis and disaster, and remained all his life proud of her beauty, her birth, and her intelligence. In later years, when they were reduced to penury, she displayed great moral heroism, and kept the family together, and basically said without her that he wouldn't be able to continue his work. Vincent just got me this idea, and we hit this a little bit before, but it's this whole, and Karl Marx himself, he's building upon all these different ideas from those who have gone before him, or even contemporaries. Same with Galileo, right? And he leaves a foundation there for people to follow him. And it just hit me, I guess, strongly in this study that how none of these people do what they do alone. And there's a whole system around them, and then it always seems key people that really help accelerate that work, whatever their work happens to be. And I guess I just wanted to say that, and basically to say without Jenny, I don't know what Karl Marx would have been. And we don't get a full picture of that, right? We get just a little snippet is all I'm reading. But who knows how influential that is? And maybe I'm saying that in contrast to what we see in society right now, where sometimes you get this fight, you have the sexist fight. Well, it's been patriarchy, the men dominating the women through history, misogyny. It's been the oppression of the women, and I don't know. I throw this light in there and say that, man, I think life mostly has been hard for people throughout history. I mean, it's been hard, and I see this example, whether you like Marx's work or not. It's cool for me to see a husband and wife, and that she contributed to his work. We can't tell how much, but probably as much as anybody. But yeah, we don't talk about that, right? We don't ever say that. It's always Karl Marx, and like not only her, but then the other influences that we're bringing up in our discussion.
Yeah.
So.
No, I think you're right. There's not. I mean, we go from Plato. You have Socrates. You have Aristotle. For Galileo, you had all his individuals around him, within the church and outside of the church, always contributing in some manner. So, yeah, and the idea of the lone, in this case, the lone philosopher, just doesn't exist. I mean, if nothing else, they have other writings of other people, if not direct contacts with other people. But yeah, I don't see Marx. This wouldn't. I mean, his wife, definitely Friedrich Engels, his father. I mean, all contributed in some fashion to give him the means to do what he did.
And I'll mention another guy here that he ran into in really Cologne at his time, but it's the same time period, named Moses Hess. And I want to read this quote from Moses Hess because it gives you a picture of what people thought of Marx. At least some people, perhaps, maybe not everybody, but and I don't think anybody's ever said anything quite this nice about me. So, so Moses Hess says this. He was a Jewish publicist from Cologne, and he said after a meeting with Marx, he said, quote this: "He is the greatest, perhaps the one genuine philosopher now alive, and will soon draw the eyes of all Germany. Dr. Marx, that is my idol's name, is still very young, about 24 at most, and will give medieval religion and politics the coup de grace. He combines the deepest philosophical seriousness with the most biting wit. Imagine Rousseau, Voltaire, Holbach, Lessing, Heine, and Hegel fused into one person. I say fused, not thrown together in a heap. And you have Dr. Marx. That's pretty big praise.
Yeah, he picked the giants of the time, and so they all come together, and we have Karl Marx. And this is a gentleman who in Cologne. So when Jason and I were talking about in Cologne, he was a journalist. Moses Hess was able to get industrialists to support Karl Marx publication of the Rheinstück Zeitung, which is a journal that came out, and so initially Karl Marx was a journalist that contributed it, and he became the chief editor in a short time. And then so just to complete that story, he came out with he started criticizing not just the German government or the German hierarchy or nobility at the time, but he started criticizing the Prussian-Russian relationship at the time, which he just did not do, because to a large extent the Prussian and Russian relationship was strong, in that they both wanted to maintain a monarchy feudal system. And once Marx started writing about that, the Tsar in Russia said, what do you have going on over there? And so they quickly squashed the magazine, the journal, and that's why Karl Marx went to Paris. Yeah.
I guess the next influence to hit really in Paris was Friedrich Engels. Yeah. And I don't know if we could say enough on how influential and a main part that the work of Karl Marx happened with Engels. But I guess I'll go a little background, Vince, here. Jump in when you have it. I have a few notes here on Engels. But their first meeting, essentially they visited for 10 days and really found that they had this lifetime of collaboration that was forming, and really a friendship. Engels ended up supporting Marx financially as well later on. Engels himself ran a textile company, so a little bit of an industrialist himself, running a textile company of his father in Manchester. But Engels had developed a lot of the similar ideas on his own outside of Marx. So when they came together, I think they had probably felt a lot of that synergy.
Yeah.
Another thing, I guess, about Engels, probably we talked about Marx maybe not having the best writing, the most influential writing, but I think Engels probably brought a lot of that out in him, or Engels probably is a better writer himself and was able to help Karl form that and cultivate those ideas better and be able to present them even more powerfully. So I think that's helping you be a better communicator, that's pretty influential. Anything else there, Vince, you see in terms of Engels?
I guess
we're going to hit more on, but
yeah, I think the only thing we'll just briefly touch on is that after Karl Marx dies, Engels carries on the idea of Marxism. And he saw it as a way. Engels was not an original thinker. I mean, that's most accounts he didn't create any of these ideas necessarily, more than he just helped Marx refine them a little bit. And after Marx died, he continued to carry on what would be an orthodox, if you will, an orthodox Marxism. He didn't want it changed. And I think the friendship, I mean, he was, outside of Jenny, Marx's wife, Engels was a mainstay. And you saw throughout time is that people would come in and out of Marx's life, and I think he would revile most of them just because they didn't keep up with him. But I think Engels was that mainstay. He was a lifetime companion. After they met, he stayed with them until Marx's death. So there's something that has to be said about that. They had a collaboration that continued, almost 40 years, 30, 40 years. So,
yeah, no, that's good. And I guess the last person I want to mention here is Proudhon. Was also part of this Paris meeting, and he had written several books and stuff as well. One of the ideas, where's Marx getting some of these ideas? One of these ideas he had, I'll find it here, is one of the books that he wrote that really talked about the It got distorted a little bit, but his best-known book, which opens up with the statement saying that all property is theft. So you start getting these ideas of private property being a real problem. And that was one of Proudhon's ideas, along with this idea, Vincent. We might throw this around. He says this: whereas competition invokes the worst and most brutal qualities in man, cooperation, besides promoting greater efficiency, moralizes and civilizes them by really revealing the true end of communal life. So basically, competition bad, cooperation good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, again, I think you can see where, as this starts refining Karl Marx a little bit. I mean, yeah. And again, I think, again, given the time and even our time, what is competition doing? In and of itself, it's creating what we'll say winners and losers. I mean, that's what it does, because you have different, you mentioned earlier, you have different competencies, you have different, whether physical or otherwise, and you're doing that. But in a collectivist idea, and it goes back to the company that we're talking about, is if everyone's the same and everyone's working towards the same thing, then there's harmony there, there's unity. But whether or not you can ever accomplish that, I think, is highly debatable. As you've already mentioned, is there's a diversity within us already. Can you minimize that to the point where everyone would want to work together? I don't know. That's as far as I can go with that one. I don't know. It's really hard to. Collectivism sounds good as an idea. The actual making that an actuality, I think, it is probably untenable.
I guess I just say on the side of competition, I can relate to my whole life, and there's been benefits of competition in my life. Especially think when I think of that word, and I think of sports, right? These competitive sports and playing at a competitive level. There's something really cool about that, because it brings out a better part of yourself. Like how well can I do this activity? How well can I do this thing in a competitive environment? Now, yeah, it can turn ugly, and it could be where I'm trying to oppress or overcome someone else. But I don't know. It's just something I think we'll probably be talking about, and something to think about, that the benefits and consequences of competition and cooperation. That's Marx's.
Yeah.
Brings those ideas in.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just trying to. But I guess that presenting a Marxist point of view is that, yeah, Jason, that the competition's okay, but if I'm 0-12 and I have a basketball team that's all 5'7", slow, and you have all 6'10" guys, is it really fair? Yeah, you keep running up the score. Can't you give me a blue ribbon every once in a while? Come on. So I think it's that idea, is that why don't we collectively play, and you give me some of your players and I'll give you some of my players, and the fun is just playing, right? It's not winning. It's the fun of the game. We're all in this life together. Let's just all get through it together. I think that's the idea.
That goes back to your story analogy, Vince. It's like, okay, now I got a story with no tension.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, I got a life with this all just hunky-dory, no challenge, no overcoming something really hard, or seeing that huge mountain there that seems insurmountable. And that's kind of the appeal of sports, right? Is like sometimes there are huge mountains that are insurmountable, but the underdog wins it. You're like, oh my God, that was such an amazing game.
Yeah.
How could they pull that off? And you take away those type of situations and times in your own life, or even to see.
Sure. Huh. Oh, all right. I have to work on that one. I have to work on that one. Yeah. Well, and as we move along too, I think what continues to be the defining argument is that even within Marx's life and after too, is that you have this idea, if I was to make it as simplistic as possible, is that you have this idea of liberalism and conservatism. This idea of progressing and this idea of being more parochial is, being as is. And that Marx obviously is more liberal. I mean, he's trying to get rid of the current monarchy of the time. And you had the conservators of the parochials who were just trying to maintain what they had. There's always been this. There's always this tension. I mean, that's just what it is. You had it 200 years ago. You have it now. You have this idea of we should be progressing to something different, and this idea that we should be maintaining what we have, or even going back, or more reactionary. Let's go back to what we had before. And I mean, you see that played out in politics today. Is the idea of let's make America great again is more of a reactionary component. Let's go back to what we were, where you have the liberals saying, let's go forward, let's progress. The progressive saying, let's move from this spot to something better. And so there's this natural tension that exists. And when I was reading about Karl Marx and Berlin's account of him, I came across this quote, and I thought, yeah, this is exactly what it was. And here's the quote. He says, "Unwilling subjects naturally grow restive and devote their lives to the overthrow of the tyrannical minority. This, when the conjunction of circumstances favors them, they eventually succeed in doing, but they grow corrupted by the long years of servitude and become incapable of conceiving ideals higher than those of their masters, so that when they acquire power, they use it no less irrationally and unjustly than their one former oppressors. In their turn, they create a new oppressed class. And so a new level, the struggle continues. At a new level, the struggle continues." So the whole idea, and this is why I started out with the Paris riots this past week, is that, okay, they overthrew the monarchy, and they thought everything was going to be great. But what happened? Now we're 200 years later, and they're still they're not happy with what currently exists. And again, it's just this, and we could talk a little bit about this, is the idea of the flawed man. There's nothing, you can't escape. Can you escape that truth? Let's call it a truth. Can you escape that truth is that, yeah, you may be oppressed, but when you take and this is the quote, is that when you take the oppressor out of the equation and you become the authority, what do? You just suppress another class. So it's this endless cycle that does not seem to necessarily progress into something bigger or better. It's just a continuous cycle of a struggle between the oppressed class and the oppressor class. Well, the oppressed class becomes the oppressor, and then just keeps recycling over and over and over again. And that's what they were talking about. And whether that's actually true or not, I think it's not as literally, it's not as linear as that, but I think it does occur. And I think I think if I was to criticize Marx and to some degree, it's that I don't think he took into consideration what happens when you overthrow a group. I mean, there is some, I think he did recognize there's going to be some difficulties, and it's not going to be easy, but once you do overthrow that group, what happens? Then you become the oppressor. Is that any better than the previous oppressor? I don't know. What do you think, Jason?
Yeah, no, that's some thoughtful stuff to think about on that. And I can see that cycle just keep going though, right? It never ends. What comes to my mind on that, Vince, is you can always have an oppressor or the oppressed. You can always make a case for that somewhere. Part of me says, well, you also missed the boat that I think life itself has some oppression in it. Just life itself, just trying to live. The nature in the world causes difficulties, causes pain, causes inequality, if you will, because of how it distributes on the human experience. So that's part of it. I had this last week I went to New Orleans for my first time. We had a safety conference out there within the vinyl industry, which is my current work right now. A really good time. My first time there, the hotel's actually in the French Quarters, right off Bourbon Street. So, I asked the my Uber driver on the way in, what should I do? Is there things to do? And of course, well, stay off Bourbon Street. I was like, oh, okay. Well, I heard that from a few people, so maybe this is really bad news. I got to stay off Bourbon Street. Well, I was right there anyway, so I didn't stay off of it completely. And it was interesting to me on several levels. On several levels, because one, you had just all kinds of people from different races, and quite a few people there on the street. Now, it was during the week, so it wasn't completely packed, but there's still quite a few people. And of course, there's a bunch of alcohol involved. There's a bunch of drinking on that street. And my 3 days there, I didn't see an incident. I didn't see an ugly incident. I didn't see a fight. And for the most part, just people trying, out having dinner, out having a good time. I'm sure there were some things that happened during that time. It just wasn't in my vicinity. But nevertheless, I kind of walked away thinking about that, and it's this idea of what's really out there. What is the reality versus what you might catch on the media? And we hear right now that we're in such a tough time, and there's such divisions and such racism and stuff. And I go, but just in my time there, within maybe not ideal conditions, right, with alcohol and probably some drug use involved in that area. And there's literally probably thousands, if not millions, of little human interactions happening throughout that time. And such a large percentage of them just were good, at least neutral, if not good, interactions. And it just gave me some perspective. I was like, okay, sometimes it's hard for us to maybe judge what things are really like on a bigger scale but it was I guess it was nice to think about that. And then, I one night I sat and talked with this guy, a younger guy. Just talked about life and his growing up and how he saw things, and I gave him some of my perspectives, and just a really enjoyable conversation for about 2 hours. And so I walked away thinking, there's a lot of hope for us, and it kind of touched on Marxism, seeing these different inequalities, different systems that we should be doing. What's the right answer? And I don't know, but maybe it's it brought me hope that there's a lot of goodness in humanity. Yeah, there's a lot of improvement to be made, but maybe things aren't as bad as what we might see if we just read the headlines out there.